Hello again, Peter.
Hi, Tamara. Hi.
So our last video was so well received, we thought that we'd like to expand upon it, didn't we? Because we just thought, no, there's more that we need to say about this. There's a few points that were covered in the last one, but some more information is probably going to be really helpful.
Yes, yeah, I thought I was surprised and pleased at how well the first video went, but I think there is yet more to say about the background to the MOU, which people may not be aware of, may help them in terms of making sense of the current debate.
Yeah. Exactly. So, would you like to clarify some of that then? Because, we're going to talk about queer theory and its relationship with the MOU now, aren't we?
Yes. So what I'd like to try and attempt here is to talk about this in a bit more detail, go into a bit more background. So the title of this session is Deconstructing the Influence of Queer Theory within the Memorandum of Understanding on Conversion Therapy, the MOU, or Why We No Longer Hang Children for Murder would be the subtitle.
A very important point as well.
Right, thank you.
There's a lot of history here.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, I mean, last time we talked previously about the UKCP's decision to leave the MOU over its restrictive stance on exploratory therapy, the resultant clash between the MOU and the CAS review, and the problems in attempting to impose the MOU on gender-critical therapists whose beliefs are strongly protected by case law. What we didn't get time to look at is what actually underlies these various presenting problems in the form of queer theory.
Which is the ideology that's underneath so many of the conflicts in the culture war at the moment.
That's right. Yes. Now, queer theory is the unspoken and probably little understood influence on the construction and language of the memorandum. I'll be arguing that queer theory generates three fatal areas of weakness within the MOU through, firstly, an assumption of a political narrative based on hierarchies of oppression. Secondly, reversal of the usual burden of proof for allegations of conversion therapy. And finally, a refusal to distinguish between the needs of children and those of adults. So starting with the first of these, the assumption of a political narrative based upon hierarchies of oppression, I think we need to start with the recent takeover of all ideological state apparatuses by the doctrine of postmodernism. This is probably the most complete and successful of all political movements in the UK since the comparable spread of utilitarianism, that is, the idea of the greatest good of the greatest number, within the courts and parliament during the 19th century. For Michel Foucault, the chief architect of postmodernism, all institutions in civil society, such as schools, families, prisons, and hospitals, are essentially designed for the purpose of exercising social control. Now, this is a fairly bleak and pessimistic view of the human condition. Thus, one critic, in referring to Foucault, states that, quote, Enlightenment reliance on universal principle and reason is always incipiently totalitarian. This is Butler writing in 2002. So this social control is thought to operate by constructing different roles and identities which are afforded greater or lesser degrees of access to power and to privilege. This is according to markers such as race, sexuality, age, disability, gender identity, and so on. Now, the MOU itself doesn't explicitly refer to the model of intersectionality as a way of understanding and potentially counteracting these inbuilt power differences. However, this concept was definitely flagged up in the MOU's evidence to the Scottish Parliament.
And intersectionality, that needs to be understood as being a later incarnation of queer theory. which, is the cornerstone of the memorandum's wider political project for gaining leverage over, education and accreditation in the future, right?
Yes, very much so. Yes, yeah.
Now, because the MOU takes its ideas from intersectionality and queer theory, it ignores material inequalities because it believes that material inequality arises from cultural inequality. But the whole ideology doesn't account for how cultural inequality largely arises from material inequality, such as the difference between the sexes. It's this material inequality that underlies the need for women to have single-sex spaces, for example.
Okay, thank you. So this background, this model, is really important in understanding the MOU's approach. And this leads on to my second point, which is that the practical consequence of this is the reversal of the usual burden of proof for allegations against therapists of practicing conversion therapy. This is something we referred to very briefly in a previous video, and I wanted to come back to this because it really is so important. And again, I think probably not widely understood by therapists or by their professional associations. So we have this overlapping matrix of oppressive power relationships, and the MOU pulls no punches in addressing the contested area of both limiting standard exploratory therapy for gender questioning clients, nor for implementing a legal ban, a criminal legal ban on conversion therapy. I mean, just as an aside, a belief in conversion therapy is an essential part of this, I would call this a persecution narrative outlined above. However, actual hard evidence for the existence of conversion therapy after about 1975 and outside of religious or faith settings is understandably somewhat thin on the ground, even from the various national self-report surveys. Now, Tamara, I think you've come the closest so far to unpicking the inverted logic of this overarching narrative of oppression within the MOU. So from your recent article against queer theory, quote, if I can, queer theory has never accounted for those who don't have any intention to oppress. It has never differentiated between heterosexuals who do and heterosexuals who don't wish to oppress. They are all oppressive just by the fact of their existence. End of quote. So, according to the unusual logic of the MOU, quote, conversion therapy is an umbrella term for a therapeutic approach or any model or individual viewpoint that demonstrates an assumption that any sexual orientation or gender identity is inherently preferable to any other, end of quote. Now,
it's been written into the guidelines of the UKCP.
That's right, yes. It's part of the ethical framework of the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy in 2018, which is currently under review. So it's embedded
which is really problematic.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. So, I mean, the standard approach, as I understand it, in professional compliance procedures is to prove that the therapist has discriminated against a client or caused distress or harm to the client through a lack of skill, mistake, or through malpractice. Under the MOU, the standard burden of proof, that is, we are innocent until proven guilty, would be reversed. The therapist would have to demonstrate that they did not carry an assumption that one gender identity was, quote, inherently preferable, quote, to another.
Which is impossible.
Well, it's certainly put any person who was trying to defend against a professional complaint or a criminal charge on the back foot. So it goes against the logic of innocent against proven guilty.
Exactly.
And presumably this would be doubly so if the therapist was perceived as being openly conventional by means of their language, dress, behaviour, background. And I think we could expect very short thrift to any therapist who might take the view that there is actually no such thing as gender identity.
Which, of course, should go against Forster.
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, just to pause here for a moment, it's interesting that the word inherently, this phrase inherently preferable, to my mind hangs rather uneasily in the air here and is quietly ominous as an unspoken threat. After all, language is important to us as therapists, as well as no doubt to lawyers. So I'm puzzled here. Is the onus on therapists to show that they have not simply assumed that one gender identity is preferable to another? What about those therapists who may have thought very deeply about this issue and yet still decided that being accepting of their own body is the best option for themselves and maybe for others too? It's not clear if this is a catch-all charge along the lines of Catch-22, with no easy way for therapists to defend themselves against an allegation, effectively of thought crime, arising from their background of unspoken privilege.
Exactly. It's that, like you said a moment ago, that, it's guilty until proven innocent rather than innocent until proven guilty.
Absolutely. It reverses that burden of proof. So how would a therapist accused by a client disprove a negative? Exactly what form of evidence for the defence could it take? So a rainbow lanyard, fulsome use of the client's preferred personal pronouns, or just a series of colourful CPD certificates from MOU-approved training providers? Of course, none of this, as you just mentioned, might well apply in the case of gender-critical therapists. Presumably, these will be protected by Vorstatter, but it might still be quite an ordeal for those therapists who have yet to take a definite position on gender identity.
Well, indeed, they could find themselves sort of tripping up without even knowing that they were.
Sure, yeah. So, and perhaps I'm labouring the point here, but how could a credible defence by a therapist against such criminal charge be possible under these circumstances? Well, in law, the prosecution usually needs to establish both proof of intent, that is, mens rea, as well as the guilty act, actus rea. In the case of conversion therapy, this question of intent might simply become immaterial because the therapist is potentially guilty of already having made a pre-existing assumption. So is this to become some kind of therapeutic equivalent to a charge of stalking, where intent to distress the victim is no longer required to decide their guilt? So it raises, I think, really difficult practical problems for therapists who are facing potential charges of conversion therapy, either from the professional association or in the criminal courts.
But also it goes to the heart, the very fabric of how our society is structured as well, when it comes to what is deemed acceptable or not.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. So the third point is the refusal of the MOU to distinguish between the needs of children and those of adults. And this next bit is really the core of my critique of queer theory's, I would say, malign influence within the MOU and of the UKCP's understandable concerns about the MOU. It takes a bit more time to go through this in order to try and make my case. So we've talked a bit about Foucault, and curiously, just as an aside, while Foucault was preoccupied with relationships of power and subordination, he actually wrote very little about the power relationships between adults and children.
Well, indeed, he was a part of the sexual liberation movement of the 60s and 70s that believed that human sexuality needed to be liberated. But, that is to be understood in the context of their fight for gay rights as well.
That's right. Yes. And that needs to be acknowledged, certainly. However, I think Foucault adopted a rather contemptuous attitude that Enlightenment principles are inevitably totalitarian and biased towards exercising social control. However, what I will be arguing is that one of the key principles of the Enlightenment, which was so despised, is the absolutely crucial distinction between adults and children. Now, to my mind, this is so fundamental. It usually comes as quite a shock to participants in workshops that I've run on children's rights over the past few decades. That is that they're surprised that children have only recently required a degree of protection under the law. Sorry, Tamara.
They're surprised about that?
Yes. I think there really is an absence of understanding of law and an understanding of history. It's as though we read the present backwards and apply it to previous centuries, when in fact there have been really radical breaks and changes, improvements, progress, if you like it, reform over the past few centuries. We didn't arrive in this current situation talking about the rights of children that didn't just fall from the sky.
It's the right of children to be protected as well.
Absolutely. So, I mean, if we go back to the 17th century, children convicted of a serious crime could be sentenced to death, transportation, or imprisonment, just like an adult. So, as an example, there was the 8-year-old boy who in 1629 was executed for burning 2 barns. I mean, this just seems incredible to a modern sensibility. A century later, a 10-year-old boy who in 1748 was convicted of murdering a little girl aged 5 had his death sentence respited and was committed to prison. So in England, somewhere around the middle of the 17th century and 18th century, the law's view shifted decisively. It abandoned its earlier assumption that children had full agency and responsibility for their criminal behavior. Then, during the 19th century and 20th century, the criminal law changed further towards a model of separating children of set ages from adults within the courts and within the prisons. This was in order to provide regimes of rehabilitation and diversion from a supposedly inevitable criminal career. The age of criminal responsibility also provides a key marker for distinguishing between adults and children. And this was raised fairly recently from 8 years to 10 years by the Children and Young Persons Act 1963.
And don't forget there's also the Criminal Law Amendment Act, which gave the age of consent for children for the first time to be increased from 13 to 16 as well.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. Civil law has also progressively differentiated between adults and children. It authorized interventions to protect children from abuse and neglect in the late 19th century through the Children Act 1889. It set limits to excessive parental punishment and provided distinct protections for children in relation to their capacity to consent to sex, as you mentioned, to consent to medical treatment, or to enter into a legal contract. In terms of seeking the views of children regarding their care, this has developed only quite recently. This was initially in social work law via the welfare principle of the 1975 Children Act, which followed the Maria Colwell inquiry. This principle of seeking the views of children was consolidated by the Children Act 1989 and, probably better known, by Article 12 of the 1989 United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. However, it was the Gillett decision of 1985 which first afforded a degree of adolescent autonomy in medical decision-making for those under 16 years with sufficient understanding and intelligence, that is, initially in relation to sexual health, contraception, and abortion.
And this is the first time that, that push for protecting the child had been reversed, where the autonomy was then placed back on the child in certain circumstances.
That's right. Gillick was the major watershed here. So now, if we look at therapy, then I guess, as we would all be aware, psychological interventions with children and young people have been seen from the time of Sigmund Freud, Anna Freud, and Melanie Klein onwards as a distinct specialism. And this approach, this area of work, needs to take full account of the child's stage of psychological development, their dependence upon adult caretakers, their vulnerability to peer pressure in adolescence, and their limited ability to take decisions and exercise full autonomy. Now, many of us will know that the Gillick decision has been widely used to underpin a higher level of confidentiality when counselling children under 16 in England and Wales. However, this confidentiality is generally limited within safeguarding practice by the need to report abuse in the public interest. If we look more widely, then the provision of education and healthcare services in the UK follow these legal distinctions fairly closely, if not always exactly. The age of majority was set at 18 by Section 8 of the 1969 Family Law Reform Act. Under this, children aged 16 and 17 were deemed capable of consent to medical treatment and to a correspondingly high level of medical confidentiality. The position of those under 16 was clarified by the Gillick decision of 1985 and its later refinement by the Axon case in 2006. Now, it's, I think, apparent that medical and psychiatric services for children broadly follow these key distinctions in law. We can see this in the organisation of child and adolescent mental health services and then transfer to adult services from 17 to 18 years of age. But, and I think this is an important point to try and make, but not even Gillick provides a blank check for the operation of complete adolescent autonomy. There is case law for the courts in overturning children's refusal of life-saving treatment or authorising treatment which the courts judge to be medically necessary.
And I think that's what gets forgotten a lot, that Gillick is not a blank slate. It's only applicable in certain contexts, in certain circumstances.
That's right, yes. So I think that came out in the judicial review of the Tavistock brought by Keira Bell and by others, that the Gillick principle was really being stretched beyond its legal breaking point, if you like. And it was really useful to have that looked at so closely within a legal context and to shine a light on the practice of the Tavistock Gender Identity Development Service. So, however, going back to this theme about the distinction between children and adults, this legal protection for children is ignored by a postmodernist approach, with its emphasis on a continuous critique of established norms and the transgressing of boundaries in the name of an enhanced personal freedom.
Smash the binary.
Sorry?
Smash the binary is the link.
Smash the binary, yes. So, and this is the point I'd really like to get across. Children are perceived and represented as proto-adults with an inbuilt gyroscopic sense of gender identity, which is claimed to be innate and uninfluenced by social media, by peer pressure, or by adult activists with their own fixed political agenda. So at one extreme, there are figures such as the pediatric gender therapist who appears to claim that pre-verbal toddlers of 2 and 3 years can signal incongruent gender identity. Quote, We've seen some kids as young as 2 whose parents are bringing them in because they're beginning to say, me not boy, me girl. Social transition can happen as soon as a child has language or the ability to communicate who they are. The therapist declared that a female toddler who pulled her hair clips out of her hair was communicating a gender message to her parents. I am a boy, so hair clips are anathema. She then says that another child, born female, who was barely verbal, at around 18 months of age, insisted to her parents, I boy, another child at 1 year of age unsnapped his stud clips on his jumpsuit to, in her words, make a dress, which she interpreted, interesting word, interpreted, as pre-verbal gender communication. This is from a chapter by Kenny. However, this might seem to some of us to illustrate very little more than the power of attribution by therapists in making their own preferred interpretation of a very young child's really quite ordinary non-verbal and verbal behavior.
Well, indeed, because, as you've just highlighted, the law is very much about protecting children and allowing them to develop and interrogate and change their mind and things, to learn and make mistakes. This stands against that principle.
Certainly, yes, yeah. So moving towards the conclusion now, the key legal distinction between children and adults, whether in terms of the courts, medicine, or therapy, seems to us as being so basic, so fundamental, and so well established in modern life that it hardly seems necessary to be spending time and effort here to point out what is painfully obvious.
Yeah, really, right?
But from a queer theory point of view, this distinction between children and adults is a complete anathema. This seems to me to be the only logical explanation for the MOU reviewing itself, presumably very quietly, back in 2022, and in then deciding that the MOU did include children under 18 after all, and also in the fact this change was so unimportant to them, it only emerged a full 2 years later in 2024. So is this key distinction in law also completely unimportant to major MOU signatories like NHS England, NHS Scotland, to professional associations like the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy? Well, we'll just have to wait and see.
And the UKCP.
And UKCP. Finally, the starting point for these two videos was to support the stance of the UKCP board in staying out of the MOU in order to defend exploratory therapy, support CAS, and recognise the rights of gender-critical therapists. What we've tried to do here is to explore some of the wider background to the MOU in terms of its overall model of control and oppression, its consequent reversal of the burden of proof for therapists accused of conversion therapy, and, critically, in my view, its refusal of the standard distinction between adults and children in a wide range of practice, but particularly within therapy. So with regard to the UKCP vote on the MOU, we suggest, if in doubt, stay out.
Absolutely. And I think that's the problem, is that a lot of therapists don't feel like they perhaps might feel confident enough in the information that they're aware of to be able to put a vote through. And, that's the point you'd like to say. If you're not sure, then don't. But if after hearing what we've got to say, you kind of understand the issues more closely, then it would be great to vote to keep the board and have them remain. Mm-hmm. All right, should we leave it there, Peter?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's about it. So thank you very much.
Clear, isn't that?
Yes.
Thanks again for your time.
Okay, and for yours. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.